Guess what? You have done such a great job with your AP US History exam review. I want to give you a trophy. And you've got a choice. I've got two trophies that look just like this. I'm just playing, but I'm pretending that I'm going to give you a trophy. And you've got a choice between two of them. One of them is gilded and one of them is solid gold. So which one would you choose? Of course, you would choose the one that is solid gold, because if it's gilded, that means that it's gold plated and it's not solid all the way through. So of course, the one that's solid gold is more valuable. And I bring this up because tonight's topic is time period 6, which really focuses a lot on the Gilded Age, which is the time period that comes after Reconstruction. So have you ever thought about why is it called the Gilded Age? Well, it's called the Gilded Age because you've got a lot of really great opportunity and a lot of new technology and a lot of new opportunities, a lot of jobs, a lot of prosperity that's taking place in the United States. It's drawing more immigrants to come to the US. But under the surface, there are some really unresolved problems. Labor disputes between big business and their workers. You've got issues with race relations. You've got problems with overcrowded cities and pollution. And none of that is really catching people's attention. So that's why it's called the Gilded Age. I'm Dr. Rhonda Webb, and I am so glad that you are here for time period 6 and our review for AP US. So let's look a little bit more closely at the content from the Gilded Age, and we know now what that's talking about. Well, one of those underlying issues that's been unresolved is some of the political corruption that's going on in government, in local and city government, and in state government in some ways. A lot of that city government corruption is tied to what are known as political machines. And those were networks of politicians that really worked within their community to maintain influence and the loyalty of their constituents. And one of the best examples would be Tammany Hall in New York City. And the party boss was Boss Tweed. There was another party boss that was part of Tammany Hall. You may have studied George Washington Plunkett. Either of those would be good examples. But what they would do is government contracts would be given out for different work projects within the city. And then sometimes there would be kickbacks of money. There would sometimes be ideas about loyalty for gaining votes, and this was an element of corruption, and it began to be more exposed by, and in the case of Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, by Thomas Nast. He was one of the famous cartoonists of the Gilded Age, and he really takes on Boss Tweed. If you've never seen any of the Thomas Nast cartoons, I encourage you to look those up because they're just tremendous. One of the other big features of the Gilded Age is going to be the rise of big business, and there are a number of ways that these big business owners make their vast fortunes in these huge corporations that they build. And it's all about maximizing profits. They can do that a number of ways. They can build monopolies or trusts where you eliminate your competition, and you're the only business in that market that's selling to consumers, so you can do whatever you want to with the price. The problem is, as they're making these huge fortunes, they're not translating those big paydays down to their workers. And so there begins to be labor disputes between the big business owners and their workers, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then you can look at these very same titans of industry, as they're called sometimes. You can look at them as contributing positively to the community by giving back through charitable good works, offering more jobs to people because of these big businesses, giving consumers more affordable products because of mass production. But then you've also got problems with them taking advantage and putting out of business smaller businesses that can't compete with these big, huge corporations. In that light, you would look at these very same business owners in a negative way and refer to them as robber barons. And so you can definitely see where this could go into a comparison question, where you could be looking at these businesses and comparing whether or not they were positively or negatively impacting society. Out of all of this corruption, there begins to be this new movement that we call populism. that actually begins in the Midwest and the West, where the farmers are experiencing some economic struggles at the time. They're not able to pay their mortgages in many ways. We've got a downturn in the economy, and they begin to turn to what we call populism. They start with these farmers alliances, which is almost like a labor union for farmers, where they're working together to negotiate contracts with the railroads. And it ends up becoming more of a political party, where they start to elect members to local and state legislatures in order to gain influence in what's happening in their state politics. When they go on the national scene, the People's Party is populism. If you look at the word populism, it comes from population, or of the people. And they write out a statement of what they want to achieve in national politics. And we call that the Omaha Platform. And one of the things that they talk about is they want the federal government to come in and regulate the railroads. They want the railroads that were really charging these, in incredible rates that weren't equal for everybody using the railroad. They would give deals to some people and not others. They want regulation of the railroads. And then one of the other big things that they want in the People's Party, or the Populist Party, is something called free silver. And that's what we really need to focus on here in just a second. We'll explain what that is, and the money supply. So this difference between big business and labor unions began to form in the industrial centers in the North. And some of the major labor unions, the earliest ones, the Knights of Labor, will be more inclusive: skilled labor, unskilled labor. You've got minorities accepted into the Knights of Labor. You've got women involved here as well in this earliest labor union. Then it begins to expand as we are looking at the American Federation of Labor. This is Samuel Gompers comes in, and the American Federation of Labor is going to operate a little bit differently, where they can fund a strike, because what these labor unions are trying to use is what's called collective bargaining. If you've got a business owner who's not giving you fair wages, and you go in and you say, I need a pay raise, at this time, because there's so many more people than there are jobs, then they're going to say bye, and they're going to bring in someone else from the outside to take your place who's willing to work for those low wages. Think about the influx of immigrants who are coming in at this time. You've got all kinds of competition for work. So as the wages are reduced, they're using collective bargaining, and there's strength in numbers. If the entire factory or labor union goes on strike, then there's going to be less likelihood that the business owners will retaliate against those workers. The American Federation of Labor will fund that in some cases, where the dues money that's being paid into the labor union would pay you at least a small amount of money while you're on strike, so that you can continue that for a longer period of time. So it's a little bit more successful than the Knights of Labor, but not as inclusive. And then the American Railway Union will be involved in all elements of the railway industry, from the Pullman Palace cars, those fancy train cars that are being produced in the Pullman factory in Chicago, to the ticket takers and the conductors and all of the people who are constructing the railroads. They would all be part of the American Railway Union. There are some important strikes that you want to make sure that you're familiar with. Haymarket Riot, that's going to be in Chicago. Homestead Steel Strike, that's going to be the one with Andrew Carnegie's plan, and you've got the Pinkertons that are coming in to try to maintain order, and you have strike breakers that are coming through, and it turns somewhat violent. Pullman strike is one where the entire railroad industry goes on strike in support of the Pullman workers who were in a factory town, a company town, and when their wages are cut, their rent was not reduced, and so they were really having a hard time. And these labor strikes are trying to put pressure on the business owners to make changes. Doesn't always work out that way. So again, think about during this Gilded Age, these are some of the big problems that are underlying on the surface. And in every one of these strikes, especially during this time period, the government is going to come in on the side of the business. We don't begin to see regulation of businesses until we get a little bit farther into the early 1900s. All right, so I mentioned before this idea of free silver, and this was something that the populists were very interested in. They wanted to expand the money supply. And this is something that my students really have a hard time understanding, is something called the gold standard versus free silver, which is what the populists were wanting. The gold standard was the money system, the monetary system that the United States was operating under during this time in the Gilded Age. And with that gold standard, that doesn't mean that the money that people had in their pocket was all solid gold. What it means is the money that's being in circulation in the United States, the value of it is backed by the value of gold that the United States has in its treasury. So if you have the gold standard, then that means that there is less money in circulation than if we went into what it was called free silver, which is going to back the amount of money that we have in circulation in the United States based on the gold and the silver that the United States has in its treasury. So if we're backing the money by gold and silver, that means we can put more money out there. So we're going to, think about this as the number of dollars that are available in the United States. If we're on the gold standard, there are fewer dollars available. And if we're on free silver, which is sometimes called bimetallism, because you have two different precious metals that are backing the money, then there are more dollars out there. But now we need to look at the value of those dollars. If there's less money in circulation, there's fewer dollars out there. That means that each one is worth more. Opposite, if we're looking at free silver, if there are more dollars in circulation, that means that each dollar is worth less. So then we need to translate that into what it means for consumers and what it means for businesses that are selling goods. So if we have less money in circulation and higher value for each dollar, that means the price that you're going to be selling your manufactured good or your crop. Now keep that in mind. The money that you're charging for selling your crop, if you're a farmer, the price is going to go down if you're on the gold standard because the value of each dollar means more. So think about what I'm saying here. If the dollar is worth more, then you don't have to pay as much to buy that same item. But if we're on bimetallism or free silver, then prices are going to go up because each dollar is worth less. So now if you're a farmer and you've got all of this land and you're growing your crops and you're trying to sell them, you want the price of those crops for what you're selling your crop for to be as high as possible, because your mortgage that you have on your land, right? You've gone in debt to buy this land that you're going to be a farmer on. And so you need to have the crop value high so that the money that you have coming in is going to be allowing you to pay off your debt. And the debt that you owe on your land is a fixed amount. So if we're on the gold standard and the prices of your crops go down, then it's going to be more difficult for you to come up with the money that you owe each month to pay your debt. If we're on free silver or bimetallism and prices are higher, then that means there's more money coming into you as the farmer to be able to pay what you owe on your land. All right, so I know that this is a little complicated, but I wanted to try to explain this. Now, let's tie this in to the existing political parties. At the time, coming into the Gilded Age, you've got big business that tends to be supported by the Republican Party, or they tend to support the Republican Party. So the gold standard, this would be favorable to businesses, okay, because their wealth that they have, the value of their wealth is higher. And so this would be something that they would be interested in. So typically, the Republican Party would be supporting the gold standard. The Democratic Party would tend to support free silver. So this tends to be kind of the middle to lower class would have typically aligned with the Democratic Party. All right, so I know that was a lot, but let's look at where this actually plays out and how this fits in with the Populist Party. So in 1892, the Populists ran their own candidate for president, and he didn't win, but he gained a few votes and carried a few states out in the West where populism was very important, because that is, again, if we think about the market revolution, that's where the breadbasket is. That's where the farmers are in large numbers. So 1896, we've got William McKinley, the Republican candidate, and look what he is supporting. He wants to stay on that gold standard. He wants a strong protective tariff that's going to protect businesses. And he also has a lot of big businesses supporting him. William Jennings Bryan is going to be the Democratic candidate, but look what he believes in. He believes in free silver or bimetallism. We've heard that before. He's going to give a very famous speech that you probably read in class called the Cross of Gold speech, where he talks about you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. And he's talking about the gold standard. You can't force the gold standard on labor, that this is, unfair to them. And again, with this cross of gold, this imagery, he's got this religious undertone that's tying that together. Government regulation of railroads and business, that also is something that we've just mentioned. The direct election of senators. So instead of the state legislatures that we already said sometimes had some corruption tied in, he wants the people themselves to be able to directly elect who the 2 senators will be for their states. And then he also wants to tax the wealthy, because if we're taking in less money by cutting down out the tariff, then we want to bring in more money with taxation. So all of these big businesses are supporting William McKinley, but guess who is supporting William Jennings Bryan? The populists, rather than electing their own candidate or nominating their own candidate in 1896, they throw all of their support to William Jennings Bryan. And they think that if they can bring in the Democratic vote that's solidly voting in the South at this point, because again, this idea coming after Reconstruction, the Redeemers, the white Southern Democrat voters were all voting Democrat at this time. If they can bring in that Southern vote with the Western vote with the populist, and then bring in some of those urban workers in the North, they feel like they have a chance against William McKinley. But it doesn't play out that way. William McKinley wins anyway in 1896. All right, but populism certainly is kind of bringing these issues to the forefront, this together. All right, immigration, we've already mentioned that picks up during the Gilded Age. You've got 2 different groups of immigrants coming in. Ellis Island is primarily for the European immigrants that are coming in. And then Angel Island out in San Francisco would be the place where Asian immigrants would be coming in, but usually had a very different experience. Most people trying to come in from Asia at this time are going to be turned away. Part of that's due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a law that is going to prevent Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States unless they already had a direct relative who was already here, and that would be hard to prove. So what does this do about wages and labor? If we've got more people coming in, especially through Ellis Island in New York, then that's driving down wages. And then we've got crowded housing. So all of that's going to be important at that time as well. Okay, we do have some reform that begins to take place here, some efforts, some movements to try to bring about some of the changes to these problems. The settlement house movement with Jane Addams and Hull House, where you've got a place for assimilation basically to be taking place. The social gospel trying to bring back this idea of morality, driving people's business decisions. And then the women's movement. Again, we already saw in the earlier time period with the Seneca Falls. Now we're going to see more women in the workplace, more higher educational opportunities. And so that kind of changes women from that old cult of domesticity where they're tied to that home and that more very limited role that women would have. One of the other big issues that comes up in the Gilded Age is this fight for equality for African Americans. And you're going to have 2 main leaders in this effort in this early time period, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And we want to compare them. So comparison always means similarities and differences. So their similarity would be their goal. They're both looking for equality for African Americans, but they want to achieve it in 2 different ways. Booker T. Washington is looking for more gradual equality to come about. He believes that if you're trying to force equality and force acceptance on people who don't view African Americans in an equal light, then that's not going to be true equality. He says that through hard work over time, that will happen. And so he is really promoting that through vocational education at the Tuskegee Institute, and then also the Atlanta Compromise speech at the Cotton States Exposition, where he's really promoting that. And then W.E.B. Du Bois has a different background, where Booker T. Washington was an enslaved person earlier in his life. W.E.B. Du Bois never was, has a more privileged background from the North. So he has a different view, and he's saying all of this equality has already been given to African Americans with the Reconstruction Amendments. Why should there be any more waiting? He's demanding that those rights be honored immediately. All right. So, and then that's going to be reinforce the issues, the segregation issues with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, saying that separate but equal facilities are okay and authorizes segregation. We've also got more conflict with Native Americans. This has been going on since the colonial period, but we're going to see the government being more involved in regulating the lands here with the reservation system, and then the Dawes Severalty Act that divides the land into sections given to Native families and then acquires the rest of the land for themselves to build more of those railroads. We're going to see a group of Indian wars that break out. These you've probably studied in your class, the Sand Creek Massacre, the battle at the Little Bighorn that was with George Custer, and then the battle at Wounded Knee. Then there are efforts at assimilation, the Carlisle School, where they take the young Indian children, they're brought into the boarding schools to be more Americanized through education. And then the Ghost Dance was resistance to this. And so part of that Ghost Dance, which was this spiritual movement that was trying to bring back the control of their native lands, that was going to be targeted by the government. So what role does the Homestead Act have in this? So the Homestead Act was that law that is going to provide white Americans with land out in the West if they move there and make improvements to the land. Well, that's encroaching on native lands as well. And so all of these are affecting Indian culture significantly.